She stood at the edge of the ballroom, invisible. Her husband's hand rested on another woman's waist. His smile, the rare one she had glimpsed only in paintings of him as a boy, was directed at Lady Clarissa Hale. The candlelight seemed to wrap around them, leaving Alara in shadow. A whisper brushed her ear, not meant for her but cutting deep. "The poor Duchess, he never even looks at her." Alara did not flinch. She had perfected stillness over 3 long years. Her gloved fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne glass, but her face remained a graceful mask. She watched Lucien St. Clair, the Duke of Montfort, guide Lady Clarissa through the final turn of a waltz with a tenderness that Alara had never felt against her own skin. The music swelled, and so did the murmurs. She had worn a gown of soft silver that night, hoping he might notice. He had walked past her in the receiving line and offered nothing but a curt nod. His dark eyes had slid over her as if she were a piece of furniture he had long stopped seeing. When the waltz ended, the Duke bent his head toward Lady Clarissa and murmured something that made her laugh. The sound was bright and confident. It stung more than any whisper. Alara set her glass down on a passing tray and walked toward the terrace doors. No one stopped her. No one called her name. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, and only then did she allow herself a single trembling breath. She clutched the stone balustrade and stared at the moon, which hung heavy and indifferent over London. She remembered the first time she had seen Lucien, long before the scandal, long before the cold silences. She had been 17, standing on a hillside in the rain. He had been unconscious, bleeding, thrown from his horse. She had torn a strip from her petticoat to bind his head wound and had run barefoot through the storm to fetch help. She had never told him. She had never told anyone. That day had been a secret carved into her heart, a memory of the moment she realized she could love someone without even knowing his name. And now that same man could not bear to look at her. She stayed on the terrace until the ballroom emptied. When she returned to their townhouse alone, she walked through the marble entrance hall and climbed the stairs to the Duchess's wing. Her bedchamber was elegant and cold, untouched by any presence but her own. Her maid had already retired. Alara unpinned her hair herself, watching the reflection of a woman who had once believed love was something that could be earned. That night she made a quiet decision. She would stop hopping. She would stop trying. She would simply exist until existence no longer hurt. The next morning she left for Montfort Park, the ducal estate in the green hills of Somerset, without telling her husband. He would not notice anyway. The countryside welcomed her with a gentleness that London never offered. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, greeted her at the door with genuine warmth, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchens. Alara shed her heavy silks and chose a simple muslin gown the color of forget-me-nots. She began walking the estate grounds each morning, visiting the tenant farms, learning the names of every child and laborer. She helped the farmer's wife boil herbs for a sick infant. She sat on a wooden stool and read stories to the village children under an old oak tree. Her hands grew work roughened, and her smile, long buried, began to stir. Weeks passed. Spring melted into summer. The Duke remained in London, attending to Parliament and his widowed companion. The letters he sent were dictated to his steward, brief instructions about estate matters. He never asked about her. She stopped reading them closely. His younger brother, Lord Sebastian St. Clair, arrived unannounced one afternoon in early July. He found Alara in the garden, sitting barefoot in the grass, a sleepy toddler curled in her lap. "Good heavens," Sebastian said, his voice full of warm surprise. "Are you the Duchess or a woodland nymph?" Alara looked up, startled, then laughed. It was a sound she had almost forgotten she could make. Sebastian was everything his brother was not: open, teasing, effortlessly kind. He had spent years traveling abroad and had only recently returned to England. He had heard about the marriage, of course. Everyone had. The forced union after the compromising scene in the library at her family's estate. The cold bargain that followed. But when he looked at Alara, he did not see scandal. He saw a woman who had been deeply wronged and somehow remained gentle. He stayed for the summer, and their friendship grew like ivy, quietly, steadily. He walked with her through the orchard, made her laugh with silly impressions of pompous politicians, and listened when her voice grew distant. He never pushed. He simply remained. One evening he said, "You deserve more than a life spent waiting in the shadows, Alara." She did not answer, but something in her chest shifted, fragile and frightening. Late August brought an unexpected storm. The Duke, with a hunting party of aristocratic guests, descended upon Montford Park. Lady Clarissa was among them, her laughter spilling through the great hall like champagne. Alara stood in the entrance to welcome them, composed and gracious, her hair neatly pinned, her gown dignified. The Duke barely glanced at her. That first night, after the guests had settled, she walked through the rose garden to clear her mind. She heard voices near the stone bench and paused. Her husband stood with Lady Clarissa, their heads bent close. Clarissa's hand rested on his arm. "You must be so weary, Lucien," the widow murmured, "carrying such a burden." The Duke did not reply, but he did not pull away. Alara turned and walked back inside, her footsteps soundless. She did not cry. She had no tears left for scenes like that. The following afternoon, she sat under the old oak tree with a book. Sebastian joined her, holding a blanket because the breeze had turned cool. He draped it over her shoulders and sat close, not quite touching, but near enough that anyone watching might misunderstand. The Duke saw them from the library window. He paused mid-step, a strange, hot sensation coiling in his chest. His brother was laughing. Alara was smiling, really smiling, her face tilted toward the sun. In that moment she looked more alive than she ever had in his memory. He felt an unfamiliar sting, something close to anger but sharper, more possessive. He turned from the window and barked an order to his steward about estate ledgers, ignoring the tremor in his hands. That evening, a formal dinner party was held for the guests. Alara took her place at the far end of the table, opposite the Duke. She wore a gown of deep blue that brought out the gray of her eyes. For the first hour, she was silent, listening to conversations that swirled around matters of politics and hunting. Then someone, a baron with a charitable bent, mentioned the poor conditions of workhouses in the north. Alara had been reading about the subject. She had even drafted a proposal for improving tenant housing on their own estate. She spoke softly but clearly. The workhouse system often punishes the desperate rather than aiding them. If we invested in local skills training, the cost would be lower and the dignity of the poor preserved. A brief silence fell. Her husband set his wine glass down with a deliberate click. "Your knowledge of such matters is limited, my dear," he said coldly. "Lady Clarissa has a much better grasp of political economy." The words landed like a slap. Lady Clarissa preened. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Alara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she did not lower her eyes. She simply placed her napkin beside her plate, rose gracefully, and said, "Please excuse me. I feel a headache coming on." She walked out of the dining room with her spine straight and her heart shattering. She did not go to her chamber. She went to the library, the very room where her life had first been broken, and sat in the darkness. The tears finally came then, silent and hot. She let them fall for exactly 5 minutes. Then she dried her face with the back of her hand and looked at the moonlight spilling across the floor. She was done. 2 days later, a letter arrived from a solicitor in Cornwall. Her godmother, a woman she had barely known but who had adored her as a child, had left her a small property, a cottage by the sea with a modest income and complete independence. No husband could touch it. No duke could claim it. The letter sat in her hand like a key. She began making quiet preparations. She told no one. She sorted through her belongings, setting aside only what mattered. In a locked drawer, she found the old brooch she had kept since she was a girl, a tiny silver dove with an enamel wing. She had worn it on the day of the accident. She had lost it in the mud and rain. never knowing the Duke had found it and kept it hidden all these years. She tucked it into her pocket, a small comfort. Meanwhile, in the Duke's study, a different kind of reckoning was unfolding. A man named Mr. Greaves, a discreet investigator Lucian had hired years ago, stood before his desk. The Duke had tasked him long before his marriage with a seemingly hopeless mission: find the girl who had saved his life when he was 23. The girl with the torn dress and gentle hands who had vanished into the storm, leaving behind a scrap of embroidered fabric and a delicate brooch. "Your Grace," Mr. Greaves said, his voice careful, "I have found a match. The stitching on the fabric, it is identical to the embroidery on a shawl belonging to Her Grace, the Duchess." The Duke went very still. "Explain." A maid recognized the pattern. The Duchess's girlhood shawl, kept in a trunk, bears the same thread work. And there is more. The brooch you gave me for comparison, a matching piece, was described in a jeweler's record. It was part of a set commissioned by the late Baron March for his daughter Alara on her 16th birthday. There can be no mistake. The room seemed to tilt. Lucian gripped the edge of his desk. The girl who had saved his life, the faceless memory he had cherished and searched for across a decade, was his own wife. The wife he had ignored, humiliated, and treated as a burden. He rushed to her chambers without knocking. The room was tidy, emptier than usual. A small traveling trunk sat near the window, half-packed. He yanked open the drawer of her writing desk and found a letter addressed to him, sealed but not yet delivered. He broke it open with shaking hands. It was not a declaration of anger. It was calm, resigned, and utterly devastating. "Lucian, by the time you read this, I will have gone to Cornwall. I release you from a marriage that has brought you only resentment. The cottage is mine, and I ask nothing from you but the freedom to live quietly. I wish you happiness with Lady Clarissa. I wish you peace. Forgive me for whatever part I played in trapping you. I never meant to cause you pain. Alara." The paper crumpled in his fist. He felt something inside him crack wide open. He had never read a more terrifying word than gone. He did not even think. He shouted for his horse. He rode through the night, the brooch and the scrap of fabric pressed against his chest inside his coat. The storm of his own making lashed at him with every galloping mile. The cottage perched on a cliff in Cornwall, overlooking a restless sea. It was small and whitewashed, with a blue door and a garden full of wild roses. Alara had been there for 3 days. She had never felt so alone or so peaceful. She was pulling weeds from the flower bed when she heard hooves. She looked up and her heart seized. The Duke of Montfort, travel-stained and wild-eyed, was dismounting in her lane. Behind him, a second rider appeared, Sebastian, who had guessed her destination and followed to ensure her safety. He hung back, worry etched on his face. Lucian strode toward her. She stood, muddy gloves and all, staring at him as if he were a ghost. "You are not leaving me," he said, his voice raw. "I will not allow it." She lifted her chin, the fragile strength of months of solitude steadying her. "You do not have the right to stop me." He stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving. "I know I don't." He reached into his coat and pulled out the brooch and the torn fabric. "But I have the right to tell you I found the girl who saved my life, and I have the right to ask her why she never told me." Alara's face went white. Her hand flew to her pocket where her own matching brooch rested. She could not speak. "It was you," he said, his voice breaking. "That day in the storm, you bound my head, you ran for help. I have kept this fragment of your dress for 10 years, hopping to find you, and you were beside me all along, and he choked. "I punished you for a crime you did not commit. I humiliated you in front of strangers. I let you think you were worthless when you were the only thing of value I ever possessed." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She shook her head. "You did not know." "I should have known. I should have looked at you once, just once, truly looked." He stepped closer. "And the scandal, your uncle's plot, I know now. I found the letters. You protected your sister. You let me believe the worst of you to spare her from a monstrous marriage. You sacrificed yourself and never defended yourself." She covered her mouth with her hand. A sob broke free. I wanted you to love me for me, not because I begged for it. Lucien fell to his knees in the damp grass, heedless of his fine boots and breeches. He took her muddy hand and pressed it to his forehead. I am begging now. I love you, Alara. I have loved you since the moment a faceless girl in the rain gave me back my life, and I was too blind to see her standing beside me every day. I am sorry. I am so desperately sorry. She looked down at him, at the mighty Duke of Montfort kneeling in the dirt, and she felt the ice around her heart begin to melt. Not quickly, not easily, but the warmth was there, small and insistent. You hurt me, she whispered, for years. I know. I will spend the rest of my life making amends if you let me. Behind them, Sebastian quietly led the horses away. He caught Alara's eye for a brief moment and gave her a small, sad smile. He had known she deserved more, and perhaps, just perhaps, his brother was finally capable of giving it. Alara pulled Lucien gently to his feet. I need time, she said. I need to learn to trust that you see me and not a ghost of guilt. Anything, he said. I will wait here on this cliff if you wish. I will court you as if we had just met. I will prove to you that you are not invisible. You never were. I was simply blind. She did not send him away. The days that followed were strange and tender. The Duke rented a modest room in the village inn. Each morning he walked to the cottage with a small offering, wildflowers, a loaf of bread, a book he thought she might enjoy. He sat with her in the garden and listened when she spoke about the tenant children, about her dreams of opening a small school. He asked no favors. He touched her hand only when she offered it first. One evening, as the sun melted into the sea, she took his arm and they walked along the cliff path. She told him about the night of the scandal, how her uncle had locked them in the library, how she had pounded on the door and wept, how she had emerged to find her reputation in ruins and her sister safe from an engagement to a cruel baron. She had accepted the Duke's cold proposal because she had no other choice, but she had also hoped foolishly that he might one day see her heart. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stopped walking and faced her. You are the bravest person I have ever known, he said quietly, and I am the luckiest fool. She smiled then, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the most intimate gesture they had ever shared. They returned to Montfort Park in late autumn. The household buzzed with quiet astonishment. The Duke moved Alara's belongings into the master's chambers himself. He dismissed Lady Clarissa with a polite but firm letter, and her name was never spoken again. He began deferring to his wife at dinner parties, asking for her opinion and listening with visible pride. The tenants, who had long adored her, watched the transformation with cautious hope. On the first anniversary of her departure to Cornwall, the Duke held a grand ball, not for society but for the estate. The great hall was filled with tenant families, servants, and local gentry. The Duke took the floor and asked for silence. Many of you have known me as a cold and distant man, he said, his voice carrying through the room. Tonight, I want to correct a grave mistake. This woman beside me is not merely my duchess. She is my heart, my savior, and the finest soul I have ever encountered. I ignored her worth for too long. I will spend every remaining day ensuring the world sees her as I do. He turned to Alara and held out his hand. May I have this dance? She placed her hand in his, her eyes glistening. Yes. The music began, a slow waltz. The tenants cheered. Sebastian, standing at the edge of the crowd, raised his glass with a genuine smile. The Duke led his duchess across the floor, and this time his eyes never left her face. This time everyone whispered, but the words were different. Look how he adores her. She was never invisible after all. And in his arms, Alara finally felt seen. They danced until the candles burned low, and when the last guest departed, Lucien led her to the terrace, the same London terrace where she had once stood alone and heartbroken. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and held her against his chest. I loved you too late, he murmured into her hair, but I will love you well." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. The moonlight caught the silver dove brooch pinned to her gown, the pair to the one he still kept in his pocket. "Then we have the rest of our lives to get it right," she said. And they did.